Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video, I want to take a look at how Pyro changed from the original concept in terms of environment and resources and why that might have happened. As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. Actually, most of you watching are not subscribed, so go on and click that button. Also, don't forget to check out the latest episode of the Comm Relay podcast and my community apps, the Hauler and the Armory. And of course, here's a shout out to our amazing patrons and YouTube members for their support of the channel and everything else I do. With the release of the 4.0 preview, some citizens have pointed out that the 4.0 implementation of Pyro is very different from the original concept of the star system. And I understand that some of you listening weren't around for the initial lore and concept of Pyro, so let me go over some of the basics. Pyro was originally discovered by a ship belonging to the Pyrotechnic Amalgamated Company, which is where the system gets its name from. The discovery was briefly forgotten about, but then the system was properly explored when the company started looking for new resource deposits to exploit. They found out two things. First, they found some very promising mineral deposits that could be mined. But second, they found out that the Pyro system's star is very volatile and regularly expels violent solar flares that damage equipment and cause harm to people. They of course wanted to exploit these resources, so they reported their findings to the United Planets of Earth, which was the predecessor to the modern-day UEE. They were eventually granted government subsidies to exploit the system and constructed extraction facilities and space stations that we know today. However, they encountered some environmental and some political issues. Turns out that the Pyro star is very volatile and it was too expensive to maintain the equipment, which is being constantly damaged. And also around the same time, the United Planets of Earth reformed into the United Empire of Earth, which resulted in the loss of subsidies. So, with the increasing maintenance costs and dwindling resource deposits, Pyro Amalgamated eventually declared bankruptcy. They abandoned all their facilities and mining claims in the system, and Pyro was declared and advertised as mined out and not suitable for colonization. But the abandoned infrastructure and connections to important UEE systems and fringe systems makes it a key location for outlaw groups looking to raid and smugglers and haulers looking to make a profit. So eventually Pyro was taken over by many outlaw groups, pirates, gangsters, and generally anyone wanting to live outside of the UEE and not minding the violence or perhaps not wanting to risk the Vandal raids into Nyx. So based on that description, what should we expect in Pyro? I would expect a system that is very poor on large resource deposits with planets that can't really support life, with some exceptions for extreme cases, for example some very resistant crabs or something. I would also expect to see a lot of abandoned ground facilities, as well as ground outposts and space stations occupied by the various factions that took over, possibly positioned in a way that protects them from the bulk of the radiation. So valleys or underground or space stations in orbit on the far side of a planet or in a dense asteroid field. And from a faction perspective, there would be several areas controlled by various factions, and since resources are relatively scarce, there would be fierce competition for what can be mined or salvaged. There would also be a big market for imported goods and materials, especially food, clean water, and properly manufactured components. This would open up many opportunities for smugglers, but also for pirates preying on haulers wanting to shorten their route by using the system. So knowing that, what is the implementation of Pyro we're actually getting? The 4.0 version of Pyro is actually pretty lively. Most of the planets have one or more outposts that are occupied. There are plenty of space stations that offer services, and there seems to be a bunch of resources that can be extracted and a lot of cargo that can be bought. And generally a ton of valuable stuff like components or weapons that can be gained through activities. So we can see that these two versions of Pyro are very different. Now, why is that? Well, if you want a simple explanation, an empty and desolate star system is boring, especially when there are only two available. If Pyro was completely empty save for a few stations and outposts here and there wouldn't be too many reasons to go there, which is fine for a French system that is going to be developed sometime in the far future. But the second system to be added to the game, CIG needed to create a place that players will actually want to visit. Not only to justify the development effort, but also to properly test the newly added server meshing technology. Now, can this difference between the original lore and the actual implementation be reconciled? And if so, how? First, let's take a look at the resource state of Pyro. I think the difference here is actually pretty easily explained. Pyro Amalgamated was a very big company, so they needed a lot of deposits and big ones to make a profit, especially given the maintenance costs of large extraction infrastructure in the system. So we can reasonably say that on a large scale it probably shouldn't be profitable to mine in Pyro, especially with any permanent installations. But there is no reason for individual miners or small groups to not be able to find valuable resources, either in deposits that were not properly explored or in waste dumps. In real life, reprocessing mining tailings and old mining sites is actually a pretty common way to extract gold and other rare metals. So to me, it's actually pretty believable that there would be something to mine in Pyro. What I find a bit weird is that CIG added some new minerals that are exclusive to Pyro. Now, some of these are rare, so it makes sense for them to be exclusive. But ice? Why can't ice, tin, and silicon be added to Stanton as well? But aside from that, the resource changes make sense to me. So, what about the dangers of the environment in Pyro? Here we need to point out that the main environmental danger got delayed. I am of course talking about the Pyro solar flares. We saw them in the first Pyro preview, but they were missing something. So CIG decided to delay them for a bit and they will come in one of the future patches. And without that big hazard, it's actually very hard to tell what the final version of Pyro is going to be like. But the current implementation is actually pretty habitable, and there are many outposts where people are just running around. And many of these outposts don't look hidden or in any way protected from the deadly solar flares. So I wonder how the NPC residents are going to react to a solar flare. Are they going to hide or just drop dead from the radiation? It will definitely be an interesting adjustment once solar flares are put into the game sometime in the future. And finally, let's take a look at the faction control over Pyro. We do have several factions that are placed in Pyro, but again we're lacking a lot of features that would give them any kind of a dynamic behavior. Right now they're just static occupants of certain locations, but we lack any kind of a reputation system that would make them react to approaching players or NPCs. But these factions offer repair missions for their facilities, which hints at the inhospitable nature of Pyro, and I guess it also gives players a non-combat option to gain reputation with the factions there. What I am also missing with the factions in Pyro is any kind of a competition for resources. I would expect to see some NPC mining and salvage ships, as well as NPC forces exchanging control over high value areas. Which brings me to contested zones. Since my last video about contested zones, I had a chance to explore them a bit more. And while I like the concept, the issues I pointed out are still present. More importantly, the actual release version of contested zones comes with some changes to item distribution. CIG moved a lot of the high tier components out of in-game shops and into contested zones as loot. This doesn't entirely make sense. I would expect the special Pyro modified components to be found there rather than factory made ones. Then again, taking fabrication into account, there is no reason a determined Pyro resident couldn't manufacture high grade factory components. In either case, contested zones can be seen as a sort of a stash, where various factions hide valuables. And this location concept would actually fit really well into the old vision of Pyro. After all, what would be a better place to hide your loot than a desolate star system? But in that case, I would expect that raiding a contested zone would severely impact your reputation with the owning faction. We also can't forget that the current version of contested zones is not final. Contested zones introduce a lot of new gameplay features which require testing, so I think CIG beefed up the rewards a little bit to encourage people to try. Now, do CIG actually need to find a way to reconcile the differences between the old Pyro lore and what was delivered? Technically, they don't. The lore, while very nice, is there to be a companion and another dimension to gameplay, so ultimately it will have to be bent in some cases to fit the gameplay. Ideally, CIG shouldn't just erase and replace lore. They should find ways to extend and develop it to fit the new narrative. But I admit, with the game being in alpha, they have a lot more room to maneuver. And with that being said, that's all for today. What do you think? Why did CIG change the vision of Pyro? Can we expect the same for other star systems? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.